Reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said to the disciples, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. The truth is, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter of the law, nor the smallest part of the letter will be done away with until it is all fulfilled. That is why whoever breaks the least significant of these commands and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever fulfills and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. I tell you, unless your sense of justice surpasses that of the religious scholars and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. You have heard that our ancestors were told no killing, and every murderer will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that everyone who is angry with sister or brother is subject to judgment. Anyone who says to his sister or his brother, I spit in your face, will be subject to the Sanhedrin. And anyone who vilifies them with name-calling will be subject to the fires of Gehenna. If you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember that your sister or brother has a grudge against you, leave your gift there at the altar. Go and be reconciled with them. And then come back and offer your gift. Lose no time in settling with your opponents. Do so while you are still on the way to the courthouse with them. Otherwise, your opponents may hand you over to the judge, and the judge hand you over to the bailiff, who will throw you into prison. I warn you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. You have heard the commandment, no committing adultery. But I tell you that those who look lustfully at others have already committed adultery with them in their hearts. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and throw it away. It's better to lose part of your body than to have it all cast into Gehenna. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It's better to lose part of your body than to have it all cast into Gehenna. It was also said, whenever a couple divorces, each partner must get a decree of divorce. But I tell you, everyone who divorces, except because of adultery, forces the spouse to commit adultery. Those who marry a divorced person also commit adultery. Again, you have heard that our ancestors were told, do not break your vow, fulfill all oaths made to our God. But I tell you, do not swear oaths at all. Do not swear by heaven, for it is God's throne. Do not swear by the earth, for it is God's footstool. Do not swear by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great ruler. And do not swear by your own head, for you cannot make a single hair black or white. Say yes when you mean yes, and no when you mean no. Anything beyond that is from the evil one. the good news of salvation. Good evening, and thank you for picking dignity over the Super Bowl tonight. The theme of tonight's readings is wisdom. Are we committed towards making wise choices? How do we decide what a wise choice is? Now, I want to start tonight with St. Paul. Chris read a passage from the first letter to the Corinthians. Paul composed that letter on the road in Ephesus, in modern-day Turkey, in the year 54 AD. And let's take a moment to pray for all the victims of the terrible earthquake in Turkey. Hearing about the problems in Corinth, in Greece, Paul dispatched a letter. Now, 54 AD was not a good year for the Roman Empire and its eastern provinces that St. Paul was attempting to grow and guide. The Emperor Claudius was seriously ill. The heir apparent was a young, undisciplined teenager. You might have heard of him. His name was Nero. The democratic and sagacious norms of the golden age of Augustus had crumbled and given way to bribery, corruption, and frequent assassinations. Paul was concerned that observing all the moral decay emanating from Rome, the Christians in Corinth might convince themselves that maybe a little depravity and mediocrity is okay after all. So when St. Paul is writing about a wisdom that is not of this age, he is referring to not internalizing the political shit show of the Roman Empire in decline. Paul's words in Corinthians would prove prophetic. As some of you know, the reign of Nero, who came to power at the end of 54, was a terrible low point. In Corinthians, Paul alludes to a wisdom that the ruling class of the empire did not grasp. As we gather here tonight, we would do well to remind ourselves that there is a wisdom we are seeking that Washington does not have any grasp on. Now, I'm not supposed to speak too directly to politics from the pulpit, and I don't need to. St. Paul's point is that we can't let the mediocrity of today's leaders infiltrate our hearts. Paul goes on to write a line that many of us know from song. Eye has not seen, ear has not heard, what God has ready for those who love God. We sing it all the time. Paul was trying to get at a paradox. When we choose to do the right and virtuous thing, we often don't know what's going to happen next. Now, I know as adults, there are advantages from planning to save for retirement, get to work on time, plan out our workdays efficiently, keep a calendar with all our doctor's appointments and social obligations, and, book flights early to save money, okay? But let's try to look at this in a different way. Do we do the right thing when no one is looking? I'm sad to break the news to you all. One of the most disarming insights from sociologists and criminologists. The fear of getting caught is a big motivator. It's also basically the only motivator. And once the fear dissipates and we don't think anyone is watching, or we don't foresee any consequences, That's when it gets harder to stay motivated to do the right thing. Paul is trying to ask us to embrace this uncertainty. That's right. It doesn't appear like anyone is watching. But if you choose wisely instead of foolishly, God is going to reward you in God's way and God's time. Our first reading tonight, thank you, Leon, comes from the book of Sirach. Now, this is a very unique piece of wisdom literature. It's one of the only books of the Hebrew Bible that we actually know who wrote it. Ben Sira was a scribe in Jerusalem in the 2nd century BC. This is a few centuries before Jesus, but several centuries after the other texts in the Hebrew Bible. Ben Sira ran a school for scribes, and he created a manual for young men, yes, it's mostly men, seeking to become scribes. And he offers an elaborate set of metaphors begging these young scribes to be wise. Now, Leanne read it well, but we've all heard this so many times, keep the commandments. So Ben Sira took a different direction in the next phrase that Leanne wrote. And he asks us to make a choice between fire and water. Are we playing with fire in our lives? Are we making poor choices that are only going to get us burnt? Or are we drawing water? Now, of course, for us here in Dignity, New York, we can easily turn on the faucet and get some water to quench our thirst. And it's actually a bit of an irony because many of us don't drink enough water and are dehydrated. In the ancient world, water was much harder to come by. There was no indoor plumbing. And water is heavy. And one had to make a journey, often an arduous one, to get this water necessity. The choices that nourish us, sustain us, and help us to move forward, they work like water in the ancient world. Now, like Ben Sira, Teresa of Avila was very fond of the water image, and she often reflected it on an image in the first psalm. The tree that is beside running water is fresher and gives more fruit. Predictably, so in 2019, some of you know that I went to Greece, and predictably, I went very far off the beaten path. And I went all the way to a little town called Lithicaro, which is right at the foot of Mount Olympus. And behind the restaurant where my tour group ate, I saw a tree growing right next to a stream. And that tree was bigger and healthier and stronger than all of the trees. The point that Ben Sira and Teresa of Avila are trying to make is to pick the water that nourishes us instead of playing with fire. Tonight, as we have done for the past few Sundays, we continued our exploration of the famous Sermon on the Mount discourse from the very beginning of the Gospel of Matthew. Now, this is the first big speech that Jesus gives in the Gospel of Matthew, dramatically set on a mountainside, echoing how Moses gave a revelation from God, the 10 Commandments. Now, there is an overwhelming amount of material in this gospel passage, and I have been given the most difficult, some of the most difficult phrases. I got a book at the library with some 600 pages unpacking all of the different metaphors in the Sermon on the Mount. Light reading, but with our limited time, I'm going to close with 3 metaphors that Jesus offers us. The first is the Pharisees. Did you catch this? Jesus says, unless your sense of justice surpasses that of the scholars and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, this is very ironic because throughout the Gospels, Jesus argues with the Pharisees. In our own time, when so many leaders in our own church have let us down, it doesn't exactly to work and try to adapt this line and say, be as righteous as Pope Benedict, who famously exiled dignity from the Catholic Church. But what if we said, be as righteous as Michael Judge? Have a sense of justice that surpasses Dorothy Day. How about that? Jesus is asking us on the mountaintop to be clear about which role models are in our hearts. A second challenging piece in this gospel speech is Jesus' commandment to control our anger and not to insult or bully others. Everyone who is angry with sister or brother is subject to judgment. Anyone who says, I spit in your face, will be subject to the Sanhedrin. This is where things get really interesting. Pay attention, this is where it gets fascinating. I spit in your face isn't really the best translation. It's actually this very bizarre word, raka. This is actually not even a Greek word. It's a translation of the Aramaic for empty-headed, worthless, and good for nothing. Get this, it's actually very likely that that is the actual word that Jesus used on the mountain. And Matthew made a choice to preserve that word raka instead of using an easier Greek word. Now, when we look at the rabbinic literature, raka is an insult, but it's not for severe situations. It's an expression of anger for stupid things that an annoying person has done. This Hebraicism, and that's what we call it when a word is from Aramaic and transliterated into Greek, we call that Hebraicism. So this Hebraicism even confused, get it, St. Augustine. And St. Augustine famously had to ask a local Jewish person in his city what the hell this word raka meant. Now, we live in a time of toxic masculinity in which unleashing anger and raka has become a performative sign of strength. But we all know that angry words often lead the other person to shut down, instead of becoming conscious of a nuance that is in their blind spot that is leading to misunderstanding and conflict. How can we sublimate our anger into something constructive instead of insulting the people we are mad at? Tonight, we have looked at many metaphors for wisdom. Ben Sira challenged us not to play with fire, but to reach for the water. St. Paul challenged us not to give into the mediocrity of an empire in decline, and to embrace the uncertainty of how God will reward us. And Jesus challenged us to embrace sagacious role models and to control our anger. Let us all pray for wisdom to make wise choices. Amen.